Hi everyone, welcome back to Life Technologies YouTube channel. I hope you're doing well and thank you so much for watching and supporting our content. So this is another episode of our Juniper Lab simulation series. Remember in our last few episodes we've discussed how to implement basic OSPF functionalities. We demonstrated how you can configure basic OSPF functionality just using 3 commands. And then we went ahead to discuss some OSPF advanced features like how to configure the metric, and then we also demonstrated how to configure the DR and BDR priority so that you can control which router in your network become the DR and which one become the BDR. We also demonstrated how to configure the interface type. By default, it's a broadcast network, so you can change the interface type to point so that you can improve on the performance of the network. So if you haven't watched that video, kindly check them out on our channel and have a look at them. And just a reminder that if you are watching this episode and you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more upcoming videos. So in this episode, we'll be looking at another OSPF advanced feature, the OSPF authentication. So we know that nowadays network security is a very important thing in the network, especially in the production network. So whenever you are deploying network, you cannot ignore the security aspect. You always have to consider how you are going to improve and protect your network. So OSPF authentication is a very important feature that you need to know how to implement on different platforms. So we have discussed how to implement it on Huawei. We have also discussed how to implement it on Nokia routing devices and many other protocols, be it ISIS or BGP. They all support the authentication feature. So in this episode, we'll be demonstrating how to implement two methods of authentication. The first one is symbol authentication, and then the other one is MD5 authentication. So symbol authentication, as the name says, it's symbol, so it's not secure enough. That's why we always recommend that you need to configure MD5 authentication. That is more secure and it's more recommended for production networks. So the reason that you need to implement authentication is you need to improve the security of your network. Imagine someone coming in with a router and then they are able to plug into one of the ports of an existing network and then they configure OSPF. No authentication is enabled, so they can just configure OSPF between the router, your router and their router, and the adjacency will come up and then they can mess up with your network. But when you implement authentication, someone has to know the authentication parameters for him to be able to connect the router and configure SPF and even the adjacency to come up, because the routers will be checking these authentication parameters. So this is a good practice. You always implement OSPF authentication as a mechanism to improve the network security. So we are using the same topology that we have used in our last few episodes. We have 3 areas: area 0, area 1, area 2, and we can verify that our OSPF adjacencies are up. So on R1, show OSPF neighbor, you have two OSPF neighbor relationship. Show OSPF neighbor on R2, we also have two OSPF neighbor relationship. Show OSPF neighbor on R3, one neighbor relationship. Show OSPF neighbor on R4, one OSPF neighborship. If you check on the interface detail, show OSPF neighbor detail, you can see that show OSPF neighbor, show OSPF interface detail, you will see that we don't have any authentication configured. So currently the authentication type is set to none. On R2 should be the same, show OSPF interface detail, no authentication is enabled, authentication type is set to none for both adjacencies. Show OSPF interface detail, authentication type is also set to none. On R4, show OSPF interface detail, you also don't have any authentication configured on this router. So we'll be going ahead and activating OSPF authentication between R1 and R4 to demonstrate how you can implement symbol authentication, and then between R1 and R2 we will be doing MD5 authentication. But remember, you always have to use the MD5 authentication that is more secure. So for us to implement basic authentication, you need to run this command, set protocols OSPF. It is in area 2, and then interface. This is the interface, and then you can use the question mark. You have the authentication parameter. You see that we can use groups if you have groups configured, or you can use the symbol password. So this one we are demonstrating how to use symbol password. Then use a question mark. You need to give a symbol password. Junos at 1 2 show pipe compare. So I will commit. And whenever we have implemented authentication on one side, you also have to implement authentication on the other side of the link. So if I quit and then show OSPF neighbor, you can see that yes, we have an adjacency that is up, but whenever the date timer elapses, the adjacency will go down because the OSPF parameters will not be merging, because we have implemented authentication on one side on R4, but we have no authentication on R1. So we expect the adjacency to go down in a few. So we give it some time. Can use the refresh command. So now date timer is 0. And now you can see that we don't have an adjacency because the authentication parameters are not merging. So the OSPF adjacency will not come up. So these are some of the things that you need to check when you are troubleshooting OSPF on your routers. So we'll go back to R1, configure, and then set protocols OSPF, area 2, interface, GE, and then authentication, symbol password, Junos at 1 2. Commit, go back to R4 and run the same command. So you can see that now we have an adjacency that is up. If I show OSPF interface detail, we expect that now the authentication type is sent to password. On R1, we can also do the same, exit, show OSPF interface detail. So the peering on area 2 has authentication type set to password. So whenever you configure the authentication parameters, you need to configure them to be uniform. You cannot configure different passwords on R1 and R4. That adjacency will still not come up. And then for MD5 authentication, we'll be configuring MD5 authentication between R1 and R2, which are in area 0. So I'll go ahead and start with R1. So we go into the configuration mode again, set protocols OSPF, area 0, interface GE, then authentication. Let me expand it. We have authentication MD5. Then you can see the key ID. We can use key ID of 1. Then key, you can also state the start time and the end time that you want the authentication to take effect. So key, I'll just use Juniper at 1 2 3. Show pipe compare. Commit and quit. Then we'll go ahead on R2. So if I show OSPF neighbor, the neighborship is up. It has also to time out before. If the timer times out, then the adjacency will go down. But I will just go ahead and configure authentication on R2. So we use the same command, send protocols OSPF, area 0, interface GE, and then authentication MD5 1. Key, we set it to Juniper at 1 2 3. Commit. Let's see that adjacencies. show OSPF interface detail. So now you can see that the authentication type is set to MD5, active ID is 1, state time, this is the start time, but you can also specify the starting time. And you can see that on the other interface, we have the authentication type set to password. So it's very easy to implement authentication on these routers. Show configuration, display set. So this is how you implement the symbol authentication. You use the word symbol password. Then this is how you implement the MD5 authentication. And I mentioned that it's always recommended that we should use MD5 authentication, which is more secure. So once you implement authentication, your network will be more secure, and then no one will just come in and plug in a router and mess up with your network. So I hope you've learned something from this episode. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and we'll be having other sessions on OSPF advanced features. And if you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us and also subscribe so that you can stay tuned in for more upcoming videos on this series. Thank you and see you in our next episode.